There is a version of you that existed before you learned to perform. Before you understood that certain emotions were inconvenient. Before you discovered that love sometimes arrives with fine print. And somewhere between learning to be good and mastering the art of being acceptable, you misplaced her. Not lost. She's not something you can lose, but buried beneath layers of should, beneath the weight of appropriate, beneath the quiet violence of becoming what everyone needed you to be. She didn't vanish. She's been waiting. Not for you to fix her. Not for you to become someone else. Just waiting to be seen again. Have you ever caught yourself in an unguarded moment? Maybe standing at the kitchen sink, maybe sitting in traffic, maybe lying in bed before sleep fully claims you, and felt something unfamiliar. Not sadness exactly. Not happiness either. Something more like recognition. As if for just a breath the performance stopped, the roles dissolved, and underneath all the noise there was still someone there, someone quieter, someone who didn't need to prove anything. And then, almost immediately, the moment passes. The noise rushes back in, the shoulds resume their familiar chorus, and you return to the version of yourself that the world has come to expect. Tensed, guarded, slightly removed from your own experience. But here's what's strange. Some women walk into a room and say nothing extraordinary. They don't command attention. They don't perform charisma. Yet something in their presence feels settled, complete, as if their mere existence requires no justification, as if being themselves is not a negotiation, but a fact. What is that? Is it confidence? Is it some mysterious feminine energy that some women possess and others don't? Carl Jung didn't see it as magic. He saw it as a psychological state, one that emerges when the fractured parts within you stop warring with each other, when the inner fragmentation that most of us accept as normal begins, however briefly, to quiet. And at the center of that state isn't some grand achievement. It's not perfection. It's not even healing in the way we typically imagine it. It's something much smaller, much older, much truer. It's the part of you that knew how to feel before you learned how to control. This video isn't about going backward. We're not here to romanticize childhood or pretend that adult responsibilities don't exist. This is about descending, not into memory, but into a living layer of your psyche, where something essential still breathes. Whether you acknowledge her or not, whether you believe in her or not, she's there. And perhaps, and this is the thread we'll follow together, healing that inner girl isn't a separate project on your self-improvement checklist. It's not step 7 in some 12-step program toward wholeness. It is the foundation, the thing everything else rests upon. When she's ignored, everything wobbles. When she's seen, the feminine essence within you doesn't need to be manufactured. It releases. Naturally. Not because you're trying to create something, but because you've stopped disconnecting from yourself. So let's begin, not with answers, but with a question most of us never think to ask. Who have you been carrying that you never gave permission to leave? Number 1. What is the inner girl? Not the memory. Not the child you once were. Something far more alive. There exists within you a part that does not age. Time moves across your face and through your body. Years accumulate. You change careers. Relationships begin and end. You become someone different than you were at 20, at 30, at 40. But this part, she doesn't keep track of birthdays. She doesn't update her understanding of the world based on experience. She simply continues. She's not a photograph you can pull out and examine, not a version of you frozen in some specific memory. The time you fell off your bike, the Christmas you got exactly what you wanted, the afternoon you cried because someone said something cruel. Those are moments. She is the thing that experienced those moments, the consciousness that received them, the emotional core that was present before interpretation arrived. Jung didn't use the term inner girl the way we do in modern psychology. But in his framework, she unmistakably exists. An archetype, a pattern embedded in the human psyche that transcends individual biography. The maiden, the divine feminine. These aren't poetic abstractions. They're psychological structures, real in the way that gravity is real, invisible, but undeniable in its effects. And here's what makes this archetype different from other parts of you. She operates from a place beneath thought. She feels before she analyzes. She resonates before she calculates. She opens before she remembers all the reasons she should stay closed. This isn't something society taught you. You arrived with it. Like emotional instinct. Like the capacity to be moved by beauty before anyone explained what beauty was supposed to mean. Think of the divine feminine not as some esoteric concept, but as a frequency. A particular quality of energy. Softness that isn't weakness. Intuition that isn't irrationality. Connection that isn't dependency. Sensitivity that isn't fragility. And the inner girl? She's the closest point of access to that frequency within your own psychology. In her most undisturbed state, before others told her who she should be, before thought learned to police feeling, before you understood that some parts of you were welcome and others were not, she simply existed. Authentic, unfiltered, alive. But here's what makes her complex. She always carries two qualities simultaneously, two sides of one coin. The first is innocence, not naivety. That's something else entirely. Innocence is the capacity to meet experience without prejudgment, to be present, to trust that what comes next might be worth receiving. The second is sensitivity, the ability to be touched, to be affected, to feel the weight of small things. And this is crucial. If you had only innocence without sensitivity, you'd be shallow. You'd float through life without depth, without the capacity to be moved. If you had only sensitivity without innocence, you'd be raw, overwhelmed. You'd lose the vitality that makes sensitivity bearable. The inner girl exists at the intersection, the balance point. Like water, soft enough to take any shape, strong enough to carve stone given time. I want you to picture something. A child standing at the edge of something vast. Maybe the ocean, maybe a mountain, maybe just a field of tall grass moving in wind. I once watched a girl, maybe 7 years old, at the edge of the Pacific. Her parents were behind her, talking about dinner reservations and traffic. She didn't hear them. She stood completely still, watching the waves arrive and retreat. She didn't ask what it meant. Didn't need anyone to explain tides or currents, or the moon's gravitational pull. She just witnessed. And in her face there was something I've rarely seen in adults. Presence without agenda. Attention without analysis. She wasn't trying to understand the ocean. She was letting the ocean be understood by her. That's the quality. That's the frequency. No performance. No role. Just presence. Real presence. And that's how she still exists within you. Needing no justification. No proof. No explanation. Just recognition. Imagine a door. On one side, the world of logic, of obligations, of appropriate responses. The you that manages, performs, delivers, and copes. The you that knows what to say in meetings and how to smile in photographs. On the other side, a different space. One where emotions are permitted simply because they arise. Where intuition speaks without needing to cite sources. Where you don't need to become anything. You already are. The problem isn't that the door disappeared. It's that you stopped opening it. And eventually, you forgot it was there at all. Jung wrote something that lands differently once you've lived enough to understand it. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. But before you can make anything conscious, you have to acknowledge it exists. Before integration comes recognition. The inner girl isn't asking you to fix her. She's not broken. She's simply waiting to be seen again. She doesn't want you to become a different version of yourself. She wants you to remember that beneath every role you play, beneath every expectation you carry, something real has always been there. An emotional aquifer. A depth that was never actually lost, only covered. And maybe, just maybe, the journey of healing her doesn't start with changing anything. It starts with something much simpler. Noticing that she never actually left. She's been there, quietly, like a door that's always been waiting for you to remember it exists. So ask yourself now, when was the last time you felt without immediately explaining the feeling to yourself? Number 2, the wounding mechanism. How the inner girl gets programmed by her environment. If she never left, what happened? Why does she feel so far away? Why does accessing her require effort, when once it required none? The answer is simple and devastating. She didn't disappear, but the way you learned to see yourself changed. Slowly, incrementally, so gradually you didn't notice it happening. From the earliest moments of consciousness, you weren't just learning language and motor skills. You were learning something far more fundamental. You were learning how to evaluate yourself, what you were worth, which parts of you were welcome, and which parts created distance. A child doesn't arrive with beliefs about her own value. She arrives open, receptive, a receiver waiting for signal. And the signal comes from the environment, from faces, from tones, from what gets met with warmth and what gets met with withdrawal. When someone listens, truly listens, a child learns my inner world matters. What I feel is real. When someone consistently turns away, interrupts, or responds with irritation, a different lesson takes root. My emotions are inconvenient. They create problems. Better to keep them to myself. When love arrives without conditions, when you're held simply because you exist, something whole forms. But when love comes with fine print, when affection depends on being quiet, or being cheerful, or being low maintenance, or being impressive, then the calculation begins. I must become a certain version to earn what should have been freely given. These messages rarely arrive as explicit declarations. They're not usually "you're too much" or "stop being so emotional." Though sometimes they are. More often they're smaller, subtler. The slight tightening around someone's eyes when you cry. The sigh. The phrase "don't be so sensitive" delivered with exhaustion rather than cruelty. Be a good girl. Why can't you just be happy? Each instance seems minor, barely worth noting. But repeated hundreds, thousands of times, they form architecture, a belief system that feels like truth because it's all you've ever known. And here's what research confirms. These repeated small moments often shape us more profoundly than isolated major events. Trauma is real and significant, but the quiet daily conditioning, the water we swim in without knowing it's wet, that's what builds the unconscious foundation. The inner girl begins recording, forming deep, unarticulated conclusions. Am I allowed to feel this? Am I worthy without performing? Is it safe to be fully myself? I remember a woman, mid-30s, accomplished, respected in her field, who sat in a circle of strangers and said something that made the room go quiet. Every time I make a mistake, she said, even a tiny one, I feel this wave of shame, like I've been caught, like something terrible is about to happen. And then I spend hours, sometimes days, being cruel to myself in my head. And the strange thing is, no one else is even blaming me. I'm doing it entirely to myself. When she traced it back, she didn't find a single defining wound. No major betrayal, no obvious trauma. What she found was a pattern, a rhythm from childhood. Whenever she did something wrong, spilled something, forgot something, said something inappropriate, she was met not with anger, but with something worse: coldness, silence, withdrawal. The message was never spoken aloud, but it was perfectly clear. You've disappointed us. And our love is now on hold until you earn it back. No one hit her. No one screamed. But the quiet repetition, day after day, year after year, shaped her inner girl with a belief that followed her into every boardroom, every relationship, every quiet moment alone. If I'm not perfect, connection will be withdrawn. And that belief didn't stay in childhood. It became the operating system. This isn't metaphor. Neuroscience confirms it. In early development, the emotional centers of the brain, the limbic system, the amygdala, are highly plastic and deeply sensitive to environmental input. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and contextual understanding, develops much later. So experiences during those early years aren't processed critically. They're absorbed directly. As truth, repeated responses from caregivers literally shape neural pathways. These pathways become the architecture of self-understanding. How you see yourself, what you believe you deserve, whether you're fundamentally okay or fundamentally lacking. And because this architecture is built so early, it operates beneath conscious awareness. You don't question it because you don't know it's there. It just feels like you, like your personality, like the way things are. Jung's words echo here. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What you believe about yourself today isn't random. It's not a reflection of your true nature. It's the accumulated residue of what you absorbed before you were old enough to choose what to absorb. Before you had the cognitive tools to say, this isn't about me, this is about their limitations. The inner girl is where these imprints live. Not as clear narratives you can easily recall, but as atmosphere, as the background feeling of yourself, the default setting. And this is essential. You are not the problem. You were never the problem. But you learned to see yourself through a lens that was handed to you. The way you feel about yourself today, the self-criticism, the unworthiness, the sense that you must perform to deserve love, that's not your essence. That's conditioning. That's what got repeated until it felt like home. The inner girl isn't wrong. She isn't weak. She doesn't need correction. She's simply carrying what she once learned to survive in the environment she was given. Understanding this is the first real step. Because when you begin to see that your deepest beliefs about yourself aren't actually you, they're things that formed in you, something shifts. A small separation occurs. You are not the belief. You are the one who can observe the belief. And from that observation, healing changes shape. It stops being about fixing something broken. It becomes about understanding how you were formed in the first place. And in that understanding, something begins to loosen. If any of this resonates, if you recognize yourself in the feeling of never quite being enough, or in reactions that seem disproportionate to what's actually happening, or in a self-criticism that feels automatic and ancient, pause for a moment. Leave a comment. Not to explain, not to justify, just a word. Hear, or seeing. Something simple, a small acknowledgement that you're beginning to notice your own story more clearly. Because noticing is where everything begins. Number 3, the persona. The mask built not from deception, but from survival. Once you start seeing where your beliefs came from, something subtle shifts. You stop simply believing them and start noticing that you've become a version of yourself shaped to fit those beliefs. Entering adulthood, the child's raw feeling doesn't disappear, but it gets covered. You learn presentation. You discover that certain versions of yourself receive warmth, while others receive distance. Not through anyone's explicit instruction, through the quiet feedback loop of social consequence. And so you build. Not a false self, that's too simple. Something more nuanced, a version of yourself optimized for acceptance, for love, for belonging. You learn which words land well and which create friction, which behaviors earn approval and which earn concern, which qualities are celebrated and which are tolerated. For women, this often means developing precise calibration, gentle but not weak, strong but not threatening, attractive but not too available, selfless but not self-erasing, warm but not overwhelming, competent but not intimidating. And over time, these stop feeling like choices. They become automatic. The role absorbs you. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. And he was careful to note, the persona isn't evil. It's necessary. It helps you navigate complex social terrain. It allows you to adapt to different contexts, to connect across difference, to move through the world without constant friction. The problem emerges when you can no longer distinguish between the mask and the face beneath it. When the persona becomes too familiar, you stop acting and start living entirely within it. You forget that you're wearing anything at all. Greek mythology offers an image that might help. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, taken to the underworld by Hades. She becomes queen of that realm, a figure entirely different from the maiden gathering flowers in sunlit fields. She adapts. She takes on the role required by her new environment. But each year, she returns to the surface. And in that return, we're reminded, her original nature never disappeared. It was simply covered by the role she had to assume. You and I are not so different. We become what our circumstances require. We adapt. We perform. We survive. But deep inside, a part of us never fully belongs to the role. You might notice this in small, flickering moments. Smiling because the situation demands it while something inside you remains still. Saying I'm fine when you're anything but. Projecting stability when you feel like a house of cards in a light breeze. These aren't moral failures. They're survival strategies. But repeated over years, they create distance. Instead of asking, what do I actually feel right now? You automatically shift to what should I be feeling? Instead of presence, you offer performance. The persona is like clothing you've worn so long you've forgotten what your skin feels like without it. At first, you chose it consciously. This outfit for work, this one for family, this one for intimacy. But over time, the choosing became unconscious. And eventually, you stopped knowing there was anything underneath. You go out into the world wearing it. You communicate through it. You build relationships, careers, entire lives filtered through it. Until one day, you realize you're not sure who you'd be without it. But like clothing, it's not your body. It's something you wear. Something that serves a function. Something that can be removed. Jung put it starkly, the persona is what one is not, but what oneself as well as others think one is. When you live too long inside others' expectations, you lose the ability to recognize your own contours. Not because your essence vanished, because you got too practiced at being appropriate. And here's the subtle truth that changes everything. The persona doesn't make you false. It only creates distance from yourself if you don't recognize it for what it is. It helped you survive. It may still help you function. But it cannot replace what it covers. You can succeed within your persona. You can be loved within it. You can build an entire life that looks, from the outside, exactly as it should. And still feel something unnamed. A sense that your life is correct, but not quite real. Like a photograph of a meal instead of the meal itself. What matters isn't rejecting your roles. You need them. They serve you. What matters is recognizing the gap. The subtle space between who you are and what you express. That gap, if you can see it clearly, becomes something unexpected. A doorway, not out of your life, not away from your responsibilities, but back towards something more genuine. Back toward the feminine core that doesn't need to be manufactured because it already exists, waiting beneath the layers. Can you feel the gap right now between the version of yourself reading these words and the version that shows up in the world? Number 4, the shadow. Repressed content in the unconscious. Once you start recognizing the gap between your true self and your performance, you'll inevitably stumble into something deeper, something less comfortable. There are parts of you that have never been allowed to appear. Not once. Not ever. And because they couldn't appear, they didn't disappear. That's not how the psyche works. What's denied expression doesn't vanish. It retreats. It goes underground. It finds storage in the unconscious, where it waits and accumulates and occasionally leaks. Not everything within you is acceptable to the world you grew up in. Certain emotions, needs, desires, expressions, because they didn't align with what you were taught was right or appropriate or feminine or good, got pushed out of awareness. Weakness, the raw need for love, jealousy that you were told was petty, dependency that you were told was unhealthy, instinctual desires that didn't fit the image of who you were supposed to be. They didn't vanish. They were suppressed. And what gets suppressed? Jung called it the shadow, the repository for everything you've learned to disown. And he said something that should stop you cold. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The shadow isn't the evil part of you. It's not your dark side in some moralistic sense. It's simply everything you decided, or were taught, couldn't be part of who you showed the world. It's quiet, unclear, always present beneath the surface, accumulating as unrecognized energy. I once observed a therapy session. A woman in her 40s, composed, rational, articulate. She said with what seemed like genuine pride, "I almost never feel anger. It's just not something I experience." The therapist didn't challenge her, just asked questions. Slowly, carefully, a different picture emerged. Whenever something upset her, a slight from a colleague, a dismissal from her partner, an injustice at work, she immediately told herself some version of "it's not worth it," or "let it go," or "I'm above this." She never expressed anger, never reacted, never showed discomfort. But anger didn't disappear. It just wasn't allowed to exist in her conscious experience. It got rerouted, stored, and the more that happened, the more it accumulated. Not as clear emotion she could name and process, but as a diffuse tension, a heaviness, an irritability that flared at strange moments, directed at safe targets who hadn't actually done anything wrong. The shadow often appears indirectly. One of its clearest signatures is projection. When you react intensely to something in another person, when someone's weakness fills you with contempt, when someone's neediness makes your skin crawl, when someone's jealousy or control or attention-seeking triggers something disproportionate. Pay attention. As Jung pointed out, these reactions often don't originate in the other person. They originate in parts of yourself you've never allowed to exist. You're not reacting to them. You're reacting to what they represent, to what you've buried. Think of the shadow as a locked room in your house. You live neatly in the visible spaces, everything is arranged, presentable, but that locked room still exists. And everything you've pushed into it over the years, every denied emotion, every rejected impulse, every need you decided was too much, it's all still there, filling the space, pressing against the door. And the more you avoid it, the more it influences you in ways you don't understand. Disproportionate reactions, unexplained mood shifts, a heaviness you can't trace to any source. Here's what makes this crucial for the feminine journey. What gets repressed isn't just emotion, it's energy, life force, vitality. Each time you suppress a part of yourself, you don't just hide it. You lock away the energy that part carried. The shadow isn't just where unwanted pieces live. It's where unused life sits. Energy that, if acknowledged, could become a source of depth and aliveness you can't currently access. The goal isn't eliminating the shadow. That's impossible and undesirable. The goal is understanding it, recognizing it as natural, as human. What's suppressed isn't wrong. It's simply what lacked permission to exist. And so it remains, not as a problem to be solved, but as a part of you awaiting recognition. When you begin to see that some dimensions of yourself have never been acknowledged, you also start to understand something else. Emotions don't disappear when ignored. Sometimes what you avoid is exactly what's affecting you most powerfully. In healing the inner girl, recognizing the shadow isn't about fixing anything. It's about unlocking what's been held back, allowing your feminine essence to return to its natural, unfragmented state, not by adding something new, but by removing the prohibition on what was always there. If you're starting to notice that some of your reactions don't come from the present moment, that they emerge from somewhere deeper, older, less visible, pause. Take a second to like this video, not for the algorithm, as a small acknowledgement, a tiny recognition that something within you needs to be understood, and that noticing it is already the beginning of bringing it out of the dark, because what's seen can begin to move, what's acknowledged can begin to integrate. Number 5, recognizing the signals. How the inner girl communicates through sensation. Once what's repressed begins to surface into awareness, something subtle becomes visible. The inner girl isn't something you need to go searching for. She's already present, already communicating. She's been communicating the whole time. You just weren't listening in the right language. She doesn't speak in words. She doesn't explain herself. She doesn't argue her case or provide clear answers to your questions. She appears through sensation, a slight contraction in your chest when you're near a certain person, a heaviness that arrives without obvious cause in what should be an ordinary situation. Or, conversely, a sudden sense of opening, of lightness, of ease that descends when you're in a space that somehow feels safe. And here's what's remarkable. These signals always arrive before thought. You feel first. Only afterward do you begin interpreting, narrating, explaining. But because you've been trained to live through reason, to privilege the logical, the explicable, the justifiable, you've learned to override that initial feeling, to replace it with a more acceptable story. And gradually, you've stopped recognizing the very real responses happening in your own body. Jung wrote something that applies here with precision. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. In moments when you don't recognize what's happening within you, you're forced to see everything as a reaction to the external world. You don't realize that your body had already responded before the external event even fully registered. You think you're reacting to what's happening, but often you're reacting to what your body already knows. Think about the small moments you've experienced but dismissed. When you're texting with someone and a single short reply makes your chest feel subtly heavier, you notice it for a fraction of a second. Then you tell yourself you're being silly, reading into things, overthinking. When you walk into a room and your body subtly contracts before you can identify what feels off. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's something, but the contraction happened. You felt it. When you're with someone and nothing particularly special occurs, yet you notice yourself relaxing, becoming lighter, breathing more fully, your guard lowering without conscious permission. These things aren't loud, they're not obvious. They pass quickly, easily overwritten by the next thought, the next task, the next demand on your attention. But if you pause long enough to notice, you begin to see. Your body always responds before your thoughts arrive. This isn't mystical. It's grounded in neuroscience. Your nervous system, particularly the limbic structures associated with emotional processing, responds to environmental stimuli faster than your rational cortex can process information. The body registers before the mind understands. Reactions like contracting, tightening, relaxing, opening. These aren't random. They're your nervous system's immediate response to present experience. Recognizing the inner girl at this stage isn't about understanding her. It's about seeing her. It's realizing that your body is always responding, even when you're not paying attention. A slight tightening in the chest, a breath that's become shallower, a fleeting sense of restlessness that arrives and departs without explanation. All of these are signals. You don't need to name them. You don't need to judge them as right or wrong, valid or invalid. You only need to recognize that they're happening. You can start noticing this in simple moments. When you're with someone and feel naturally at ease, what does that ease feel like in your body? When you suddenly withdraw without knowing why, what happened in your body just before the withdrawal? These responses don't need immediate explanation. They don't need to be solved. But if you begin to notice them, you'll see something unmistakable. They always arise before any thought does. Awareness here isn't about holding on to the feeling. It's not about changing it. It's simply about seeing clearly what's happening within you before you intervene. Just a moment of recognition. I'm contracting, or I'm opening, without doing anything further, without trying to fix or analyze or understand. That moment of pure noticing is already a profound internal shift. The inner girl doesn't need you to react. She doesn't need you to fix anything. She only appears through subtle signals. And the only thing required at this stage is that you don't overlook them. No analysis, no judgment, no immediate need to understand. Just recognizing that there's a part of you that's feeling. And you're beginning to see it more clearly. Perhaps this is the deepest foundation for healing her. Not doing something different, but returning to pure awareness. The feminine essence within you can gradually reveal itself naturally through the very real sensations you've begun to notice. So ask yourself right now, what is your body doing as you hear these words? Is there tension somewhere? Ease somewhere else? Don't change anything. Just notice. Number 6, reparenting. Reestablishing relationship with the inner girl. When you no longer just notice those signals and let them pass, when you begin to stay with them a little longer, something subtle emerges. You start responding to what you feel, and that response is where the real transformation begins. Reparenting isn't an abstract concept. It's a practical, moment-by-moment act. You gradually become the person your inner girl once needed but didn't have. Not through grand gestures, through how you respond to yourself in very specific, very ordinary moments. When insecurity rises, instead of ignoring it or criticizing yourself for feeling it, you stay with it. You keep yourself company through the discomfort. When you feel hurt, instead of forcing yourself to be strong or dismissing the hurt as weakness, you allow that emotion to exist without denial. You give it space. When something crosses your boundaries, you begin learning to say no. Not to oppose others, to protect what's within you. Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And in this journey, acceptance isn't an idea. It's a daily practice. Choosing, again and again, not to abandon yourself in your most vulnerable moments. You might recognize this pattern in a well-known story. Oprah Winfrey has spoken openly about her childhood, marked by emotional deprivation, by growing up without consistent safety or the experience of being fully heard. But what distinguished her trajectory wasn't just what happened to her. It was how she gradually learned to treat herself as an adult. She didn't deny her wounds. She didn't force herself to become a version untouched by her past. Instead, she began giving herself what she'd never received: being heard, gentleness, respect for her own emotional reality. That shift in how she related to herself became the foundation for every other transformation. Reparenting, in this sense, isn't about returning to the past to fix it. That's impossible. It's about changing how you treat yourself in the present. Right now. It's realizing you no longer need to keep repeating what once hurt you. You don't need to force yourself toward perfection to feel worthy. You don't need to ignore your emotions to be acceptable. You don't need to shrink to belong. Imagine creating a new internal environment. If your inner girl once had to adapt to a lack of safety, to unpredictability, to conditional love, to the constant need to perform, now you begin offering something different. Stability, consistency, a space where she doesn't need to brace herself to survive. This doesn't happen all at once. It's formed through small, repeated actions. How you speak to yourself when you make a mistake, whether you offer yourself the same grace you'd offer a friend, how you allow yourself to rest without guilt, whether you listen to your fatigue or override it with should. One of the clearest changes is that you begin establishing boundaries, not as a way to control others, as a way to protect your internal space. You realize that not everything needs to be accepted. Not every relationship needs to be maintained if it consistently makes you contract. And each time you choose to protect yourself instead of dismissing your feelings, you send a clear message to your inner girl. You are safe here. What matters is that reparenting isn't about becoming more perfect. It's about becoming more consistent with yourself. You stop treating yourself the way your old environment taught you to. You begin choosing a different way. More conscious, more gentle, more authentic. And from this shift, something natural begins happening. You no longer need to try to liberate your feminine essence. Because when the inner girl feels safe, the feminine within you opens automatically, not as effort, as a state where softness is no longer weakness, where sensitivity is no longer a burden, where you can exist without hiding any part of yourself. So consider this. If you're realizing you're beginning to no longer abandon yourself in your most vulnerable moments, leave a word in the comments. Safe. Just that. A small affirmation, a quiet acknowledgement that, maybe for the first time, you're becoming a safe place for your own inner girl. Because safety is where everything begins to heal. Number 7. Individuation. Integrating the inner girl into the self. As you move through recognizing, confronting, and gradually learning to care for yourself, a profound shift begins completing itself. The parts that were once separated, the inner girl, the persona, the shadow, the adult self, stop standing alone. They begin finding their places within a more unified whole. Individuation, as Jung described it, isn't about becoming a better version of yourself. It's about becoming more fully yourself, more complete, more integrated. The inner girl is no longer something you need to return to or heal as a separate project. She gradually becomes a natural part of how you exist with yourself. Not a memory, not a wound, a living dimension of your present experience. What was once pushed out of awareness, emotions denied, needs deemed inappropriate, expressions suppressed, begins being recognized as valid parts within one inner system. A viewer named Anna once shared something that captures this shift perfectly. She said she didn't realize it in some dramatic breakthrough. It came in a small, clear moment. Previously, whenever she felt insecure in a relationship, she'd do one of two things: try to control the situation, manage her partner's behavior, seek reassurance, monitor everything, or withdraw, completely shut down, go cold, protect herself through distance. But over time, after months of awareness practice, of noticing her signals, of reparenting, she began responding differently. One evening, insecurity arose. Familiar. Old. She felt it in her chest, that tightness she knew so well. But this time, she didn't rush to act, didn't immediately interpret it or demand it be resolved. She simply noticed it, stayed with it, and at the same time continued the conversation calmly. There was no resistance, No immersion in the emotion either. For the first time, she felt she could both feel and remain present. She didn't have to choose between being emotional and being functional. And in that moment, she realized she was no longer fragmented. The parts weren't warring anymore. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This isn't a distant goal. It's the natural outcome of an inner process where you no longer need to reject any part of yourself to feel whole. When the inner girl is no longer separated, you don't need to go back to her. You carry her with you. In how you live, how you feel, how you choose, every day. And at this point of integration, a core truth becomes visible. Healing your inner girl isn't a separate step on some growth checklist. It is the foundation, the thing everything else rests upon. When the deepest part of you is seen, accepted, and integrated, you no longer need to seek balance externally. A stable state begins forming from within. You can feel without losing control. Stay with yourself without hiding. Imagine a piece of music where, previously, the instruments played separately. Each had its own rhythm, its own key. Sometimes they clashed. Sometimes they ignored each other completely. But when integration begins, the sounds don't disappear. They find a shared rhythm, a harmony. No part is eliminated. Everything is reorganized so it can coexist. Conscious and unconscious are no longer opposed. Emotion and reason stop pulling you in different directions. They begin functioning as one unified system. The most noticeable change isn't in what you do. It's in how you exist within yourself. You no longer need to fight emotions to maintain stability. You no longer need to be carried away by them to find truth. You can feel without being overwhelmed, recognize without needing to control. From there, an inner identity forms, not based on becoming someone else, based on no longer abandoning any part of yourself. Individuation isn't the end of the journey. It's the state from which you begin living from a clearer inner center. The inner girl is no longer a memory, no longer something to be healed. She's a living part of your psychological structure, contributing to the depth and wholeness of how you exist with yourself. And perhaps, when the journey reaches this point, you realize what you were searching for was never about becoming another version of yourself. It was about gradually returning to yourself fully, without fragmentation, where every inner part has its place, and you no longer need to choose between feeling or controlling. You can be both within the same presence. After everything we've moved through, what matters most isn't how much you've achieved. It's that you've begun to see yourself differently, no longer as something to be fixed, but as a whole returning to its natural state. Healing your inner girl, in this sense, isn't a journey to become more special. It's the process of no longer abandoning the deepest part within you, where every feeling, every reaction, every movement has its own meaning. And when you no longer turn away from yourself, you realize change doesn't come from the effort to control. It comes from a presence deep enough that you no longer need to resist any part within you. That is the true foundation for your feminine essence to unfold, not as something you create, as a state you return to. If this video touched you, not in some grand dramatic way, but in a small, real, quiet way, share it with someone who's also on this journey, not because the algorithm needs it, because sometimes knowing we're not alone is the thing that makes the next step possible. And subscribe to continue along the path. Not for more content, for more presence, more returning. Because this journey isn't about becoming someone else. It's about gradually coming home to yourself, step by step. In every moment, you no longer abandon yourself. The door has always been there. You just remembered you can open it. Walk through.